All right, so welcome to session 4 of our supply chain track. Glad to have so many of you back with us. This has been such an exciting turnout. So glad to see all of you and see that you made it through with us today. It's a long day, right? Hopefully it's been a good day, lots of learnings, lots of meeting people, but it's a long time to be on. Well, with that, I'm excited to help close our supply chain track with Carolyn Woznicki. So Carolyn just retired from Illinois Tool Works in August, so retirement is new for her, but she is a great giver back within our university system. She's on our executive board for the Granger Supply Chain Management Program, and so of course I nudged my friend Jake Dean and to nudge my friend Carolyn and said, wouldn't Carolyn be a great speaker in our annual conference? And Jake, of course, said yes, she would. So Carolyn has worked for, like I said, Illinois Tool Works, which is a Fortune 200 global multi-industry manufacturer. She'll talk about all those complexities. She's also had long leadership roles at Johnson Controls and General Motors. So I'm very excited to close our supply chain track here with Carolyn Woznicki. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. And great to be here. Hopefully you guys are still raring to go, even though we're at the tail end of the day. And hopefully I can get the clicker to work. There we go. I really should say a little bit here about this title. Jenny asked me to talk about influencing in a decentralized environment, and I'm going to give you a little bit more insight into what I mean by decentralized environment when I talk about Illinois Tool Works. Before I jump into it, though, I thought I would give you a little bit more about my background because for sure the 40-plus years that I've spent in these different companies has influenced who I am and some of my thinking. So I started my career at General Motors when I was 18, and I thought that would be my place for life, honestly. I went to General Motors Institute, which is now called Kettering University, and it was a fantastic place to be. Biggest company in the world at the time, so how things change, right, over the decades. But it was a great place to start my career. I went from GM to Johnson Controls and first spent 7 years in Johnson Controls Automotive division, which was headquartered in Michigan, and then was asked to move to Milwaukee, which is why I'm now a Wisconsin person, to help integrate their largest acquisition at the time when they bought the York Corporation. And so I came in and, I guess, integrated the York Corporation with the rest of Johnson Controls building efficiency segment. And that was super interesting, a super big challenge, and today I would say the division is flourishing, although many changes in Johnson Controls as well have occurred over the last, let's say, decade. So I did recently retire from ITW, so I'm still basking in the glow of retirement. I highly recommend it for those of you that are thinking about it. So I'm still counting it in weeks, so it hasn't been that long. And what I would say about ITW is what a great capstone to my career. I spent about 10 and a half years at ITW, and I was enticed to go there because I had worked for two great big centrally run companies, and ITW was decentralized, and I thought, I'm going to take a stab at how you would do sourcing specifically in a decentralized company and be able to achieve results, and that is what enticed me to kind of go to ITW. And I started there as the VP of Strategic Sourcing when they were initiating strategic sourcing for the company. And then along the way, they gave me environmental health and safety as well, which was super cool. There aren't very many functions within ITW that have any semblance of a central kind of group. And so it's a little bit of, I want to say, an oxymoron. ITW talks about themselves as an entrepreneurial, decentralized company, and yet they implemented strategic sourcing as a centralized opportunity to create some value for that company. Pretty important to kind of know that, because in order for us to be effective, we had to figure out how to influence in this very decentralized company, which was, I'll say, a challenge. It was a worthy challenge. I mentioned I went to GMI. Along the way, I also got my MBA from Oakland University in Michigan. Been married to Mike for 37 years. I have 3 sons that are adopted, 2 from Russia, 1 from Tennessee, 2 dogs, and I also have a foster daughter that we fostered for 13 months. So if anybody wants to be a foster parent, I highly recommend it, even though it was hard. And we recently, this summer, decided that we would be the host family for a professional baseball player who plays for the Milwaukee Milkmen. So he's living with us now, too. I like to bring people in. And I would say every one of those experiences has been awesome. Not without some ups and downs, but awesome. So let's keep going. So Illinois Toolworks, how many of you actually ever heard of Illinois Toolworks? So maybe more hands than I thought of went up. ITW is not a household name. It's about Fortune 200, $15.2 billion revenue in the last fiscal year. So it's a big global company that makes many things. 7 business segments is kind of how they organize the company. Each of those business segments is roughly $2 billion, with automotive being the biggest at about $4 billion. Automotive, large supplier to all of the literally all of the OEMs globally, many different things, probably known for fasteners. But if you drive a vehicle that has a fuel system without a cap on it, that capless fuel system, ITW invented that. There's more than us that make it now, but we're on most of the Ford vehicles. That's an example of one of the things that ITW does. We own Miller Welding, so headquartered in Appleton, Wisconsin. Polymers and fluids, you might know the brand names Rain-X, Slime, Permatex. Those are all ITW companies. Construction, you might know the name Pazload, Alpine, ITW companies. Specialty products makes a variety of interesting things, packaging equipment. But if anybody buys a 6-pack of beer, that plastic 6-pack ring, ITW invention, and we're the sole producer of that globally. Test and measurement. Yeah. Test and measurement and electronics is, again, even in that segment, it's pretty diverse. But if you drive by a truck scale on the side of the road, it's probably an ITW truck scale. In that platform, we make scales, we make very large, custom, $1 million plus pieces of equipment that do durability and reliability testing. They're called a 4-poster or 6-poster machine for the vehicle industry. So that would be something in that group. And then our food equipment group, probably the biggest brand name is Hobart. So we make Hobart kitchen equipment, commercial kitchen equipment specifically, dishwashers, ranges, broilers, fryers. So somebody mentioned Chick-fil-A earlier. Please do go to Chick-fil-A because our fryers are in use there. But you can't be more than probably 6 feet away from an ITW product. Inside your mobile phones are some adhesive strips that come from ITW. And if you have a credit card on you, likely the white strip or maybe the whole credit card came from ITW. And if you're carrying a passport or a driver's license from a different state, the security plastic, which is etched, is also an ITW product. So many things that we make that are super cool, but all different. So you can imagine that as a company, we have to be decentralized because each of these products kind of stands independently of themselves. They're designed uniquely, they have unique customers, and they're different. And therefore, our belief as a company is decentralized is the way to go. Bottom of this. So 7 segments, roughly 83 divisions, each led by a VPGM, and that equates to about 400 plants globally. So strong influencing skills needed to try to create a connection and leverage and execution that delivers value for the company. So one of the things that I wanted to weave into this presentation, because it's been super impactful for ITW, and I would say super impactful for me as a leader as I learned it as part of ITW is this way of thinking that we refer to as 80-20. 80-20 is one of the core secret sauces of ITW. It's an operating mentality. We, of course, in this room, we all know about 80-20, right? Because we all learned the Pareto principle at some point in our education. And that is the Pareto principle, but the way ITW applies it, I would say, is much more sophisticated than just 80-20, and a much more sophisticated way of using this data to kind of drive decision making, and actually more importantly, to drive where do we put resources into the company. And so I want to talk about this 80-20 mentality a little bit and give you a view of how might it work, in particular in sourcing, but you can apply it to any function, and you can also apply it to the bigger business decisions that you would make, and our VPGMs in particular use it to think about what customers do they want to serve, what products do they want to continue to make, and other decisions that are key to how they would run their business. So from a sourcing perspective, if you look at these 4 boxes, the AA box, the quadrant there, would be, that's an 80 commodity by spend that goes in an 80 revenue product by sales. So we have really important products that we sell to customers, and it actually rises to the level of it's an 80 spend that goes into 80 customer products. That would be the AA box. And from a sourcing perspective, I'm going to devote resources to making sure that we strategically tackle that AA box or quadrant of products and suppliers that serve the company, because it's critically important to the success of our company for multiple reasons. We want to protect sales, and we also want to make sure that we drive capable supply bases that are also competitive, delivering the quality we want, et cetera, that support those very important sales for the customers. So if you think about the 6-pack rings that I mentioned before, the plastic resin in those 6-pack rings would be in the AA quadrant. It's an important product for the company, and that resin is the most important product for that particular product. So we have important resources that we focus on that. So the AB quadrant would be, let's say, an 80 component by spend, but maybe it's in a 20 revenue product. So it's important to me from a sourcing leader's perspective, but it might not be quite as important from the business perspective. And so some examples there would be fasteners. We produce a lot of things, lots of equipment and lots of other things, and most of it takes some kind of a fastener. Individually at a plant level, those fasteners would always be a C item. Not a huge spend. They need them for sure to make their product, but it's always going to be a C item. When you add up the 400 plants, however, you would say we have tens of millions of dollars of fasteners, and it rises to the level at a corporate perspective that it is an 80 spend category. So I'm going to devote some resources to that, but we're going to interact with the businesses maybe in a slightly different way, because each of the plant might not be that interested in the fastener spend because it's just not that big for them. But on a company level it is, and we addressed it with some corporate resources working with the divisions to try to leverage that spend for them and on their behalf. So the BA box would be the opposite of that. So it might be a 20 spend from a company perspective, but it might be an 80 revenue product. And so what's an example of this, and how might that look like at ITW? We have a division that makes test equipment that uses radioactive isotopes. If anybody buy radioactive isotopes? Oh, okay, so radioactive isotopes are super expensive. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to the microgram, and they're effectively all controlled by the government. French government, Russia government, US government. And you have to have special containers to ship it, so that's part of the transaction as well. The business that makes the test equipment that uses radioactive isotopes, for them, this is an 80 item, because if they don't have it, their test equipment isn't effective, right? So they have to get this material. From a corporate perspective, no other division uses it, and it actually doesn't rise to the level of a corporate spend category, so frankly, we're not devoting corporate resources to that as a category. Super important for the particular plant and division, not so important for ITW. So that's a view of how I decided to allocate my resources at a corporate basis and how we were going to attack that commodity. The BB categories would be not 80 spend categories, not 80 revenue categories for the company. And so how we tackle that is really not going to be with a lot of resources. And I wanted to reflect and say that, you know, my experiences evolved from working from the biggest company in the world, GM, you know, decades ago, to ITW. I vividly remember at GM when I was in sourcing that 2 years we had a process that was called a plan for every part. Like that was the mantra, a plan for every part. Today, consultants will often sell you on the tail spend and how to manage the tail spend, you know, including resources and data and et cetera on the tail spend. I would say my mentality at ITW, now being immersed in the 80-20 philosophy, would think about that a lot differently. So if you manage the tail spend, that 20%, even if you get 10% out of it, have you really moved the needle? I would say not so much. And so it's not that we ignored the tail or the 20s, but we managed them in a different way with different resources, or we left it to the decentralized environment and the plants to deal with it because it wasn't going to move the needle for the company. And it was okay for us to do that because we had alignment with the whole leadership team that it was actually better to not create a huge resource pool at corporate to get involved in 20 spend items that weren't really that important. So important to know that at GM, that wouldn't have been the mindset. The mindset would have been plan for every part, we're going to resource every part. At ITW, no. We're going to focus on the 80, and we're going to have a lean, mean operating team that focuses on the 80, and we're not going to dilute our resources by focusing on things that aren't going to matter. I want to share a story on this point that is interesting. My young son, you know, just started his supply chain career, and he was working for a company. And he came home one day, and he was telling me that the project that he got was to go negotiate with a supplier that was not on their standard payment terms of net 60. I said, oh, how big is the supplier? What's their spend? $5,000. And I, you know, worked the math through with him, like on a piece of paper, and I said, so if you move this $5,000 annual spend supplier from net 30 to net 60, what is the cash value going to be to the company? And I think the number was like $516. And I said, at ITW, I would never ask you to do this. And it was just kind of an interesting reflection about different philosophies of different companies. And I'm not saying it was wrong. I'm just saying that as I reflect on how we would devote our resources, that's not a project that ITW would have devoted a resource to. Just, I wanted to make it real for you, because it happened, you know, a few months ago, and it was on the top of my mind in terms of a conversation. So that's kind of in a simple way 80-20. I guess a few things that I want to say more about it is that depending on your perspective, 80-20 looks different. So at an ITW level, our $9 billion of spend, we knew what categories made it into the 80 at a corporate level, and there were 113 of those. However, if you were at a division, a multi-plant division, your 80 categories might not be the same categories that rose to the 80 level for the company. My example is fasteners. If you were at a single plant, your 80 categories might not be the same as the division or the company. And so at different levels of the organization, the resources were deployed to focus on the relevant 80s, depending on the perspective, that they had for those commodities. So that's a nuance that I wanted to share with you because that's, I'm going to say, part of the magic that makes ITW work in our very decentralized way, because we had different levels of focus depending on if it was a plant, a division, a segment, or the company. And our resources were deployed differently, but depending on that. Let's go. So I think I talked mostly about all this. So strategic resources went on high spend categories and on some low spend categories that affected 80 revenue products. What also drove some of the decision making is if a category was cross plant or cross division, and then we truly had the impact to leverage it across boundaries, then the corporate resources would likely jump in there and help make that happen. We de-emphasized, I already said this, the tail spend, and we would only use corporate resources when the aggregate of that spend rose to the level of being an 80. There were about 100 categories that were 80 focus areas for ITW. There were more than 1,000 categories at the corporate level that were 20 focus areas that we mostly left to either the divisions or the plants. Another thing that ITW operated on from a philosophy perspective is that the divisions own the decision rights. And so if you came from a corporate centralized management structure like I did, GM, Johnson Controls, I was very used to, making a sourcing decision, or my team making a sourcing decision, and then you would deploy that, right, with the plant, and they would go forth and execute. That's not how it works at ITW. At ITW, we would get involved and we might run the sourcing event for a particular commodity and present the outcome or the results or the decision-making process to the division, and they own the decision rights. So if they don't want to go with the corporate recommendation, it's up to them. And so being able to communicate effectively in order to, I'm going to say, sell, why you think this is the right decision for them to produce the best outcome, super important. And you had to learn how to speak their language, knowing that they were averse to change, because change in a plant always creates some level of chaos, for sure. It always pulls in resources that they are, woefully short of. And so there really has to be a compelling message in order for them to buy into whatever that decision recommendation might be. It for sure requires influencing skills. So when we think about strategic sourcing and how it worked at ITW, this probably looks very similar for any of you in the sourcing environment, whether you're centralized or decentralized. There's some value that you can bring to the equation, and you want the folks involved in the decision-making process to really think about that value. So days payable outstanding. I would tell you at ITW that wasn't that important. We're a company that generates $1 billion of free cash flow a quarter. And I can remember when I started my job at ITW, I went to the CFO and said, this should be a priority. And he looked at me and he said, no, that's not going to be one of our priorities, because what we care about is margin, and DPO isn't that important. And so we went forth, and that's what we focused on. Savings and economics, for sure, right? The single biggest thing that sourcing gets measured on, we measured it. Innovation, how do suppliers help bring in innovation to the company? New product introduction, warranty, how do we manage that? No stock outs, customer time to fill order, and inventory. And actually the three on the bottom, not always easily measured, from a pure sourcing perspective, but actually as we think about, I would say ITW, we had, depending on the division, some customer promises. And Miller Welding might be a great example. Miller Welding's typical promise is if it's a stock component, our promise is that if you give us an order by noon, we're going to ship that order by 5 p.m. the same day. Think about that as a promise. That's pretty significant. And so in order to do that, that meant that we had an investment in inventory, and that was part of our supply chain strategy. And we were very diligent about making sure that we looked at stockouts and inventory levels for those components that went into the stocked items. But very strategic in terms of how we manage that. So when we did sourcing, and in terms of trying to influence, this is a really busy slide, and I don't mean for you to read all the words, but we developed a common template in terms of how to convey the story of what's our strategic sourcing category for a particular category. This one happens to be temp labor. At individual plants or divisions, temp labor did not rise to the level of an 80. For the company, it did. And so we devoted some corporate resources to having a common approach to how are we going to manage contingent labor, contract labor, and this is sort of what that summary looks like. Again, you don't need to read each of the words, but we wanted to tell the story and be able to use it to communicate in a simple way with our internal customers and talk about what are your business unit needs and requirements to make sure that we're reflecting on what they needed to achieve with this spend category. What's going on in the supply market? Talk about that. What's the risk assessment related to contingent labor? You know, for the plants, they needed labor and they needed labor fast. And so the risk to them wasn't really great in this category as long as the recruiting agency could deliver good people. We talked about our current situation. You'll see, you know, X millions of dollars to spend across 200 plus agencies. So that's an example of the decentralized, I would say, sourcing that was happening at ITW, right? 200 agencies. That's like, there's no leverage there, right? So we were trying to create some leverage. We had a brief description of what the strategy was, and then we talked about what's our future state. Our future state is to go from 200 agencies to 5 to 6 preferred that can serve us regionally and lower the cost to serve to our plants. And that, you know, served us well in terms of convincing the divisions to work with us and to kind of move forward to create value for the company on this category that was, frankly, tens of millions of dollars for the company. So the communication method in terms of influencing these stakeholders that were all over the place and having a way to convey that story in a, I think, a simple yet thorough way was part of our secret sauce to influencing an outcome. We also, as part of this particular strategy, developed, we thought, a pretty simple but clear timeline. And so if you were in the Northeast, here's what your timeline looks like for implementation. If you were a plant in Ohio, if you were a plant in Minnesota, if you were a plant in the Southeast, if you were a plant in Texas. Again, we made it relevant and I think pretty clear to the impacted plants. Here's what you can expect in the future as we go about deploying this particular strategy on contingent labor. So I want to talk a little bit more broadly about influencing strategies, and I think first and foremost it's listen first. When I joined ITW, again, I was given permission to take my time and understand this very complicated business. And in fact, my boss said, you know, Carolyn, we don't expect you to like change things in 6 weeks or even 90 days. We want you to learn the business, ask questions, listen first, and then let's talk about what your proposed changes were. And valuable advice, and I would say valuable advice for all of you that are going into a new role or where you're trying to influence indirectly. Listen first. One of the things that I think people sort of make a mistake about is they want to prove how smart they are, right? We do, it's sort of natural. You want to prove credibility and you want to prove how smart you are. And I didn't need to do that, right? I needed to listen first, and that made a big impact because the teams and people that I was talking with could see that I was interested in understanding their problem or their business. I probably can't say that enough times. The second influencing strategy is to seek and build relationships with senior leaders who can be allies. And I would tell you that that's not necessarily natural for me. I'm pretty good at socializing with folks, but I didn't typically seek out senior leaders to be my allies, but I really needed to do that at ITW. So some of the EVPs that ran those $2 billion businesses, I would ask, to go to lunch, once a month or so with me and just chit chat, right? Because we were building a trusted relationship. And you heard that mentioned earlier today from one of the presenters about building a trusted relationship. It doesn't happen overnight. And if you need somebody, hopefully you've already built the relationship by investing in the time to do so before you get to the point where you say, God, I could really use your help, and you don't quite have the trusted relationship that you'd hoped that you would. So build relationships with senior leaders who can be allies and seek their advice. So another human thing or trait, I would say, is that people like to be asked for advice, right? Because it demonstrates that you respect their opinion. And so ask them. Even if it might not be the same thing that you thought you'd hear, ask them for advice. It's about learning how they think. Another influencing strategy, develop options and have a clear pros, cons, or cost for each, and use storytelling when you do this. So if you use sound data, that's a big aspect for gaining credibility as you tell that story. Discuss the ideas. I found that socializing these concepts ahead of the meeting where you thought you were going to talk about it was super important, because sometimes you could ferret out, somebody's objection before you showed up in this meeting and they kind of torpedoed it, right? So if you could have the pre-meeting before the meeting, pretty important. Frequent communication. So as we were implementing sourcing strategies, and I would say especially when I first got there 10 and a half years ago, our first big strategic sourcing act was to go address steel. And many divisions were involved, many plants were involved, and there was a need to frequently communicate with not only the folks at the plant level, but also the leaders, because everybody was worried that sourcing was going to wreck the business, right? I'm just being honest, right? People were worried that we were going to screw it up by making a source change that was going to drive the business to the ground, and so frequent communication was super important. As was gaining approval. And when I mentioned that the decision rights were retained by the divisions, that took away a huge level of, I'll say, fear, because no matter what the corporate sourcing team came to them with from a sourcing decision, they still knew that they owned the decision right and they could say yes or no. And so the fear factor kind of dissolved quite a bit because of that. Execute well and execute credibly. So we gained, and when I say we, I'm talking about the whole corporate sourcing initiative, we gained credibility as we executed. And so some of those early projects addressing big commodities went relatively slowly because we didn't want to miss a beat. We knew that if we missed a beat and it went sideways, that all of the naysayers would say, we told you so, that you could never do strategic sourcing in this decentralized company, it'll never work, right? So it was more important for us to execute well and execute credibly at the start. And so again, for those of you that are doing sourcing, and as you think about influencing, you're going to gain influence every time you can check the box in a positive way that it worked. It's easy, right, to say that, hard to execute, but super important. And then share success. So as we created this corporate sourcing group, one of the things that we wanted to be sure of is that we made sure that the division and plant who was impacted by the sourcing event owned the success and ultimately the margin that was accretive to them. So out of all the jobs that I've ever done, our accounting for sourcing savings is the most conservative at ITW. Most conservative out of any company that I've worked at. We didn't count indirect savings, MRO, some of the other things, the contract labor. We didn't count the savings because you could never really find it in the P&L, right? It was an expense item, and you couldn't really closely count it. So we said, you know what? We know this is good work. We know it's the right thing to do, but we're not going to count it in a savings tracker because we want credibility. We only counted the stuff in the current year that we could see was accretive to margin, and we were not quite 100%, but over 98% aligned with finance in the tracking. So for the whole time that I was at ITW, nobody ever debated our numbers because the success was at the plants. That's where we counted it. We didn't count anything called corporate savings. It was always at the plants, and it always aligned with finance. And so the celebration, or the success, if you will, was always the plant's success. Can't say that enough, but corporate wasn't trying to claim anything. We didn't want to claim anything. We wanted it to be claimed where the division was that benefited by the increased margin. So I think I already talked about listen first. To spend a little bit more time on this, what I would say is seek to understand. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And again, somebody said this earlier in the conference, use that proportionately, but listen to understand. Not just listen because you feel like you have to, but really seek to understand and ask questions. Another thing that's a key strategy is repeat what you heard to make sure that you understand it. And I can for sure tell you that there's a number of times where I repeated back what I thought I heard, and they said, no, that's not what we mean. Oh, okay, let's say that again, make sure I get it. Ask the business what they view as their big priorities, because it might be different than what you thought their big priorities were. As an example, the highest margin business in ITW is welding. This is public information, so I'm not sharing any big secret. You can see it, in our reported earnings. And early on, I remember going to welding, and we wanted to propose some very significant supply changes. That wasn't their priority. Their priority was to protect the highest margin business in the company and grow. And so we had to revisit what we were proposing in terms of supply opportunities because it really didn't match what their business desire was. They wanted to de-risk their supply chain, not go after some incremental margin when they were already doing, frankly, great. So that was a great conversation to have. Another example is a low margin business that did need help leveraging their supply chain for savings and help. And as well, they needed the sourcing team to help them build a story for their customers so they could go ask for price increases. Because we understood the mentality of purchasers and what was happening in the commodity markets, we also put together the story so they could go sell to their customers why they needed a price increase. And so sourcing partnered with them to help drive their margins up in maybe a slightly different way than just also working on lowering the cost of the supplies that we bought. So seeking help from senior leaders who can be allies. How it worked at ITW is we had a savings school that was a corporate savings school, but every leader of the business, so those 83 VPGMs who ran their P&Ls, they each had to bake into their P&Ls how much they were going to achieve from sourcing. And that was super important because it meant that they were invested in the outcome as well. It wasn't just something that got thrown over the wall. We were united in our pursuit of the savings. Another example
Carolyn,
of how this looked like.
We're actually getting pretty short on time,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Can I ask, do you want to
Sure.
end on your share successes?
For
Because I
sure.
know that was one of your key takeaways.
Yep.
Thanks.
So let's get to this, and I think I already really described this, but basically all savings were attributed to plan execution. There were no corporate savings. And to really track this, we created a project tracker that was created, and it tied out to the P&L achievement. So again, a nuance, but it became an important part of the credibility and how we influenced in a very decentralized way. So with that, I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, we can take 1 or 2 questions. Thank you, Carolyn. Anyone have a question for Carolyn? We'll have our mic runner in the back that can come up. Yeah, if we can have one right here.
With 400 business units, data is pretty critical to do all this. How long did it take you to get the data together? How many different ERP systems existed across all those facilities?
So that is a great question. We have over 200 ERPs distinct, and it took me about 8 months to get the data that I needed. I will tell you that I went down one path that I needed to change because I thought we could get every ERP to create a common taxonomy in their local ERP, and that quickly got squashed. And we hired a company called GEP to aggregate all the data files and then harmonize and cleanse them and apply a common taxonomy to that data, and we have it for the whole company.
Great. Well, I think Carolyn can probably stick around here for a couple minutes if you have some more individual questions for her, but one more round of applause for Carolyn Woznicki. Thank you, Carolyn.